Hey everyone, welcome to a Good Run podcast with Daniel Feldman. I'm Asher Feldman, and I'm introducing episode 12, Liz Holtzman for Congress. In this episode, Dan and I discuss Elizabeth Holtzman's underdog campaign for Congress in 1972 on the heels of Dan's involvement with the John Lindsay primary campaign for president. As a reminder, we will be posting new episodes hopefully every other week from here on into the summer. So make sure to keep up with us on Twitter, our WordPress blog, and on your favorite podcasting app. Until then, hope you enjoy this episode, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, everyone. Everybody, welcome back to a Good Run podcast with Daniel Feldman. I'm Asher Feldman here for episode, I guess this is episode 12. Mm-hmm. We're speeding right along. So welcome to the podcast again, Dan.
Thank you.
I know last time you spoke with Leah about the Lindsay campaign, which I think you called a very unsuccessful presidential campaign,
Yes.
which I thought was funny.
Yeah, it was kind of an all-time unsuccessful.
All-timer, great. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure that was an interesting kind of wind down once that was done. I'm wondering what was the mindset. I know you returned to law school. What are you thinking as you're getting back to Massachusetts?
Well, at that point, it was very unclear who would be the Democratic candidate. It was clear enough it wasn't going to be Lindsay, but right. McGovern was showing a lot of strength, but there was a real possibility that the regulars would broker the convention from Husky. It was unclear. Mm-hmm. I think I found the Lindsay campaign very disheartening, and it kind of, as much as I wanted to defeat Nixon in 72, and I surely did, I think at that point I was a little down on the presidential race. I don't know whether I really thought this at the time, but to the best of my recollection, I think my feeling was, look, whoever the Democratic nominee is, I'll get involved then. It's, I think I'm done with the primaries.
Right.
But then after about a month or so of law school, I get 2 phone calls, each from a candidate running in a Democratic primary for Congress in Brooklyn, and each a friend of mine. And when it's a personal friend, obviously it's a different dynamic.
Yeah.
One was from Al Lowenstein, mm-hmm. and who was running against John Rooney, who was an incumbent. Al at this point was sort of looking for a congressional district. His old district was in Nassau County. This district was in Brooklyn, but he was anxious to get back to Congress. And Rooney was a hawk on Vietnam, very right wing, represented some very liberal areas like Brooklyn Heights, which was always liberal. And I think Al felt that he could win there, and so he moved to Brooklyn to run against Rooney. And so Rooney, as I said, was this real right-wing Democrat, but friends with J. Edgar Hoover and so forth. And Liz Holtzman was taking on Emanuel Seller, who was considered the dean of the House, who was 84 years old at the time, but had been in the House for 50 years. He was, I think, the longest-serving member of Congress ever, except for Carl Vinson, who was like 51 years or 52. Seller had actually been a truly great member of Congress for many years. He was very instrumental in enacting the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I mean, he was a fine member of Congress. But as he got much older, he became, shall we say, more set in his ways. He kind of actively opposed the Equal Rights Amendment. His ethics reflected an earlier era in that he had like 2 different, the law firm had 2 different signs on it, one including his name and one not, because if there was something where there's a potential conflict of interest with his position in Congress, you'd go to the law firm without his name on it, but it was still his law firm. It was stuff like that. It was no longer really considered quite appropriate.
Sure.
So my analysis of the situation was as follows. Al Lowenstein has friends every place. It's the district is a liberal district. Al's surely going to win anyway. He doesn't need my help. Poor Liz is running against Seller. It's ridiculous. I mean, she has no chance. But if I help her, maybe it won't be completely humiliating. She'll get 20% instead of 15%. So I decided to help Liz, making exactly the opposite calculation that most politically astute people make. They'll go with the winner. I, of course, go with the loser.
Right.
So I thought. As it turned out, of course, my prediction was entirely wrong. Actually, wasn't. I shouldn't say it was entirely wrong. I believe Al actually won that race against Rooney. But
wait, so hold on. You're saying that Lowenstein lost that race?
Well, he did not get the congressional seat. What happened was
the congressional primary.
The congressional primary.
Right.
What happens? What I believe happened, and I think most observers agree, was that Rooney's troops, regular organization, etc., stole enough votes in that race so that there was in fact a rerun declared.
Really?
Yes, there were enough irregularities so that the courts required that race to be run again, and it was about a month and a half later. But unfortunately, the regular organization was better at pulling out votes than the reformers, and the initial primary in those years, the congressional primary, was the same day as the presidential primary, thus pulling out all those voters who wanted to vote for McGovern for president, or for his electoral slate.
Right.
So the turnout in the rerun was much less, and that time Rooney really did win. So Al didn't get the seat. But as I said, he might not have been entirely wrong. He maybe did win, except it was stolen from him. But in any case, Liz's campaign was, Seller himself said, and the vast majority of political analysts agreed. He said it's like Seller's famous line was, he said, "Hal Holtzman running against me is like a toothpick trying to topple the Washington Monument." And that was the conventional wisdom, which, frankly, I kind of thought was the case, too.
Right.
But Liz was a phenomenal campaigner. She was indefatigable, never stopped. Every morning was subway stops. Every afternoon was bingo parlors for the senior citizens. Every evening was movie lines. Just never stopped campaigning. And her message and her persona were effective. Here was she's running against an 84-year-old guy who had opposed the Equal Rights Amendment. Here is this eminently qualified young Harvard Law School graduate, female, clearly energetic. You could see how the people would say, well, maybe it's time. And the classic example was when we were in. I was running the 43rd Assembly District. I should back up and explain that.
So when in the campaign did you join? How far along was this movement when the time you got?
As far as I can tell, it was probably about 6 weeks before the primary.
Okay.
But things were just getting organized. For example, I was. In New York, the building blocks, the fundamental unit of election organization and analysis is the Assembly District.
Right.
So a congressional district like Sellers would have spanned parts of 5 or 6 Assembly districts and some entire Assembly districts. I was responsible for one of the largest ones, which I think virtually the whole 43rd Assembly District in Brooklyn was in the congressional. And when I say I was responsible, that meant that I went through the lists, the official lists of voters that are published by the Board of Elections by party, as people registered by party. And we would use reverse directories. One way or another, we'd get phone numbers, and we had the addresses for each voter. And so we would both foot canvass, which means go door to door and ring the doorbell and say, you'd see from the list who they are, Mr. So-and-so, Ms. So-and-so. Are you planning to vote? Do you have any leanings? Do you know who you're planning to vote for? And if they're going to vote for your candidate, in my case, Holtzman, if they say we're voting for Holtzman, that's a 5. We're leaning toward Holtzman, it's a 4. We haven't made up our mind, that's a 3. We're leaning toward Sellers, a 2. We're voting for Sellers, a 1. And you collect these because it can make an important difference, as much as 4 or 5 percentage points at times, whether the people who say they're going to vote for you actually make it to the polls on election. They may think they're going to vote, but they may not get around to it. A lot of people don't. Mm-hmm. So you want to identify your favorable voters and then get them out to the polls. You don't always catch people in the door-to-door canvass. You also make phone calls. And so one of our callers, this is kind of memorable, is dialing the phone, says, "Hello, Mr. So-and-so, are you..." in the phone canvass, you don't. Sometimes it's a pure canvas. Sometimes it's a push canvas. So that you say, Mr. Seller is 84 years old. He's been around for a very long time. Perhaps it's time for a new representative. So as one of our callers was making the pitch, Mr. Seller is 84 years old. The person on the other end of the line says, "Well, I'm 84 years old," and so we just said something irretrievably wrong. Right. And then the person on the other line continues, "And if he feels the way I do, we shouldn't be in Congress anymore." But apparently that was not altogether unrepresentative. Mm-hmm. By the way, just for our listeners, if any don't know, propensity to vote varies directly with age. So your senior citizen voters are very likely to vote. That's an extremely important cohort in the demographic. So it matters. But in any case, Liz was a tremendous campaigner. She, of course, had already been in government as an assistant to Lindsay. Not that Lindsay was so popular at this point, but it was still a decent credential for Liz. Right. She was Democratic district leader in the 44th Assembly District next door. So she wasn't altogether lacking in credibility as a candidate. Right. And so we were working very, very hard. And as it turned out, she lost every assembly district in the congressional except, I'm proud to say, mine, the 43rd, where she won a big enough margin to win the race. Mm-hmm. It's, I think, something to note just in terms of let me preface this by saying that it's very easy for a successful candidate, myself included. In later years, I got elected to the legislature. But it's very easy for a successful candidate. When you succeed, you are very tempted as a human being to attribute your success to your own merit, and this may well mislead you into thinking that politics is in fact a merit system, right, which by and large it's not. And the Holtzman race, in some ways, supports that point. I'm not saying that Liz wasn't the meritorious candidate. She certainly was. She was enormously well qualified, and she became a wonderful member of Congress. However, her victory in that race would not have happened but for three different factors that were, two that were entirely beyond her control, and one that had our efforts been successful, I believe she would have lost. Those are as follows. I talked earlier about the Lowenstein race. Well, as I mentioned, many people assessed the situation the same way I did, but came to the opposite conclusion. So that
they threw their support behind Lowenstein.
The reformers threw their support behind Lowenstein, but the regulars threw their support behind Rooney. Mm-hmm. They thought, well, Seller doesn't need our help. He's obviously going to win anyway. Right. And so the International Longshoremen's Association, which on the Brooklyn waterfront was very powerful, put their troops, their personnel into Rooney's campaign. Any support that Meade Esposito could rally from anyone else, and there was plenty, money, whatever Rooney needed, became available to him. Whereas Seller himself said, I don't need help, I'll do fine. Right. So that was one factor, that the organization didn't really fight Holtzman hard in Seller's district because they took for granted that he'd win.
So before you go on to the other two, right, let's dive deeper into that. What is the, I guess, political calculus that goes into those types of decisions at the time? Obviously, there's media coverage of this stuff. There are political insider information. What is happening simultaneously, what are the forces at play to make those kinds of decisions, the ones that the unions make, the political organizations make? What are they thinking about?
Well, in the case of the longshoremen, they were mobbed up.
Oh, okay. That's one reason.
And I suppose, to the extent that a prominent member of Congress can discourage investigation and prosecution,
they were hoping.
I'm speculating, but I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case.
Mm-hmm.
Then there may more, I suppose, legitimate. I don't know whether the ILA had. 72. I don't know whether they had already achieved the guaranteed annual income. At a certain point, this may get too deep into shipping and freight issues, but I'll try to do it briefly. Container freight had already begun to replace break bulk freight in shipping by that time, which meant fewer jobs for longshoremen because the container freight movement was far more automated.
Right.
The longshoremen worked out a contract with the shippers that essentially guaranteed a certain income to every member of the union, regardless of how many hours they put in. When you're negotiating with shippers in that way, it certainly helps to have support from members of Congress because, the Uniform Maritime Act. Various pieces of legislation affect shipping, and if influential members of Congress tell the shippers, look, why don't you go ahead and sign this? Those members of Congress will be influential because they affect legislation that the shippers need as well.
Right.
So that's just one little example, but
it's that kind of thinking that drives involvement, supports all of the structure that goes behind those types of campaigns. That's right. Okay. So interesting. So then the confluence of the Lowenstein campaign simultaneous to the Holtzman campaign, that's one factor.
That's one factor. A second was George McGovern. The head of again, Holtzman was the reform candidate, as was Lowenstein. And there, I think in some other podcast, we may have talked about palm cards. I don't remember if we did or not. Mm-hmm. So, all right, you remember the palm card has the top of the ticket on it and also the races lower down that whoever is handing out the palm card, presumably in our case, the reform organization, supports all those candidates. Right. And so people, even in a year like 72, there's a substantial percentage of people, I don't know how many, but a substantial percentage who pay attention to the presidential race, but not a lot of attention to the congressional race. Well, if they are coming out to vote for McGovern as the anti-war candidate and they see that, this person Holtzman is on the palm card, they may go down the ticket and say, okay, I'll vote for her too. So the head of her slate was McGovern. The head of Seller's slate was uncommitted. Why? Because the regular organization recognized at this point that there was enough anti-war sentiment that putting Muskie at the top of the ticket, who is anti-war but not nearly as forthrightly so as McGovern, would have turned off some voters. So they felt, Seller is strong enough on his own. He doesn't need somebody heading up. There as it turned out, voters getting a palm card that says uncommitted for the electors slate for president, and then McGovern turned out to do far better than anybody expected. Right. So far more voters looked at the card saying McGovern in his slate and said, yeah, I'm voting for that. They get a slate that says uncommitted and Seller. I'm not voting for that slate.
So does the palm card have to have the presidential slot in it?
You can do any palm card you want.
Right. I'm wondering why they didn't just do that.
That's a good question. They could have.
Yeah.
I don't know why either.
Was there not?
because there was an uncommitted slate. There was a slate of delegates that were running uncommitted. In other words, they would be able to decide at the convention, and the regulars wanted that slate to win.
But they were comfortable with being, literally uncommitted?
Yeah, but what they would have said to the voters was, look, we don't know who the best candidate is yet. We're gonna go to the convention. You can, they're generally community leaders. You can trust us, and we'll try to make an intelligent choice when it happens in play, because all the facts aren't in yet.
Right.
Look, even remember, even I thought, well, I like this former governor, but who knows? I don't know if he's going to win. There was a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah. So
that was factor number 2, the uncommitted slate. The third factor, in some ways the most interesting, was this fellow O'Donnell. There was a third candidate in the race
for Congress. Liz's congressional.
Correct. Yeah. And Liz thought, that there would be some voters who would have maybe didn't want to vote for Seller, but if O'Donnell was on the ballot, they would vote for O'Donnell, whereas they would otherwise have voted for Holtzman. So therefore, we undertook a strenuous effort to get O'Donnell off the ballot. And how do you do that? You go through the signatures. You see if they're duplicated. You see if they're not, if they didn't put the address in correctly. You see if the witness statement is wrong in any way. Right. There is all you
described that process earlier.
Okay,
as well,
so you go through the petitions, and there was a time-consuming, very strenuous, and very tedious. You can imagine how boring that is. Yeah. Effort, which failed. O'Donnell stayed on the ballot, and my recollection was that he had gotten 3,000 votes. Almost 5 years ago, we had a reunion. I think it was the 40th reunion of the 72 victory. And one of the fellows there was Lou Sterler, and Lou actually had kept records. And he said, no, O'Donnell got 4,000 votes, not 3,000. And I would trust Lou's numbers better than my recollection. So our later election analysis showed that O'Donnell did not split the anti-Seller vote. He split the Seller vote. People who would otherwise have voted for Seller voted for O'Donnell. What was O'Donnell's play? Who was he? He hardly campaigned. It was mostly ethnicity. I mean, the vote was I don't remember how many votes, probably 50,000 or more votes for Seller and for Liz, and 4,000 for. I mean, it was a minor. It was just the name. A few people will vote for an Irish name, presumably. Fair. But Liz won by less than 500 votes. Really? Had we succeeded in getting O'Donnell off the ballot, she would have lost. And by a significant margin. Right. Wow. So, now, by the way, there were some people at the party who thought I was wrong about that, but that recollection is much firmer. That he did split the Seller vote, not the Holtzman vote. In any case, what that should have taught me, it didn't, but what it should have taught me was that so much of politics is happenstance and things other than merit. If any one of those three things had been different, if we hadn't had a candidate as strong as McGovern at the presidential level, hadn't had a candidate drawing away regular strength as significantly as Lowenstein did, or if O'Donnell had been knocked off the ballot, if any of those things had been different, she would have lost. And the implications of this were tremendous. I mean, Emanuel Seller was chair of the House Judiciary Committee, a position that was significant, but by 1974 became considerably more significant. Yeah, I can only imagine why. Right. A fellow named Nixon, another fellow named Peter Rodino, who became chair of Judiciary. Right. So, this, leaving aside Liz's own contributions, this was a very historic event. Had very far-reaching consequences, and could so easily have gone the other way. Huh. That's fascinating. So do you feel like... well, that was the primary, right? So yeah. Was there a general election to really worry about in that case, or not really? No. It was in Brooklyn at that time. There was in those years during the anti-war years, there was a citywide umbrella organization called the New Democratic Coalition. But regular party people who were aware that statewide, certainly Republicans do pose a threat. Yeah. Used to make fun of us NDCers as they said it stood for November Don't Count. It's all about the primaries. But essentially in Brooklyn, it didn't. Right. I mean, frankly, years later when I ran for the assembly, after I won the Democratic nomination, I would go around campaigning, and occasionally my Republican opponent would campaign next to me.
Mm-hmm.
Barry Kaufman was his name, and he would introduce himself as follows. He'd say, "My name is Barry Kaufman. I'm the Republican candidate for the Assembly, and this is Dan Feldman, your next Assembly member."
It was like that.
It was like that. Yeah.
I mean, no, that makes sense. So I guess my final question as we kind of wrap this down. The 43rd Assembly District that you were specifically responsible for, that included what parts of Brooklyn?
Parts of, it was sort of, I'd say, North Flatbush. It's from, Ocean Avenue to, say, Bedford, or maybe Nostrand, and then from maybe Farragut or Glenwood all the way up to, I don't know, maybe Eastern Parkway. I don't remember exactly, but that general area. That was slightly northeast of the district I later represented.
Right. So the question kind of alludes to that. Probably a pretty diverse assembly district you were.
Actually, at that time, it was predominantly Jewish.
Okay.
Within, I would say, 15 years, it became predominantly black.
Right. Interesting.
So.
Okay. So I'm wondering, maybe in spending a significant amount of time in that part of Brooklyn, are you beginning to feel like this is maybe where you might start thinking about your own representation?
No, absolutely not. What I was thinking about at that time was running where I lived in Queens.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, during this period when I was working for Liz, you know what? During the Holtzman primary, I guess it must have been, I was already involved in working for McGovern in Queens. When I came back from law school to work for, I completely forgot this until you just mentioned it. At the same time I was doing Holtzman work during the day, I was doing organizing for McGovern in Queens at night, partly with the notion that I would then be organizing for McGovern in my home district.
Right.
Partly with the notion that I would then run for city council in
Queens.
In Queens.
Fascinating. Right. And why? What was the choice? Why was that choice being made? What were you?
Well, I thought that's where I lived. And also, we're getting onto the next.
Yeah. Well, this is a teaser.
Right. My city council member was not well regarded as a legislator.
Interesting.
And
you thought a grassroots kind of organizing movement.
Very much following Liz's example.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I think we'll talk about that on the next episode. Okay. So thanks so much for sitting down.
Thank you for having me.
We'll conquer that next time.
Awesome. Terrific.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks. See you guys next time.